This is the first in a series of videos that will be dedicated to individual stories and poems by Edgar Allan Poe. Rather than proceeding chronologically and beginning with early stories like Manuscript Found in a Bottle or Berenice, I've decided to begin with The Pit and the Pendulum, which is one of Poe's later stories, probably written in Philadelphia during his tenure as editor for Graham's magazine. The reason I decided on this particular story as our starting point is that it develops a number of Poe's core ideas and themes and illustrates several important facets of his mature narrative technique, all of which fall under the title Problems of Perception. The Pit and the Pendulum first appeared in 1842 in a popular literary annual titled The Gift, a Christmas and New Year's present. This was a showcase for American authors and illustrators that was published regularly throughout the 1830s and 40s. I'm going to begin with some remarks about Poe's narrative style, starting with the term Gothic, which is often attached to his name. I'm going to talk about the Blackwoods formula, then first-person narration, and manipulation of narrative time, all as elements of Poe's narrative style. So when it comes to Gothic, what readers often mean by that term is that his stories contain familiar horror tropes like gloomy settings, overwrought architecture, and an oppressive atmosphere of menace, mystery, and the supernatural, all of which is of course true and present in abundance in The Pit and the Pendulum. But early 19th century Gothic was also political. This was a period when old feudal institutions faced tremendous resistance, fueled by advances in science, economics, and technology. Society was reorganizing around a new liberal ethos, where change and resistance were most fierce, revolutions were fought, and the representatives of old world power, the monarchs, aristocrats, and dark-cowled clergymen would become the villains of Gothic novels, and their ruined castles and churches the symbolic remnants of an oppressive, outmoded political economy. The narrator of The Pit and the Pendulum certainly fits the profile of the persecuted Gothic hero. He identifies himself on page 312 as a bold recusant, that is, someone who refuses to bend to the authority of the Catholic Church, which is represented here by the black-robed judges of the Spanish Inquisition, an institution renowned for authoritarian violence. The revolutionary narrative is brought to an abrupt conclusion in the final paragraph of the story when the narrator is saved from falling into the pit by the arrival of Napoleon's army in Toledo and the liberation of the prisoners of the Inquisition. Poe was not the only writer, of course, making a name for himself with stories like The Pit and the Pendulum. Blackwoods was an important Scottish literary magazine that had developed a reputation for printing sensation stories that place characters in bizarre situations of extreme physical and mental duress. The magazine was already immensely popular by the time Poe launched his magazine career, and stories like The Pit and the Pendulum, with its prolonged, relentless sequence of medieval tortures, adhere to the Blackwoods model. At the same time, Poe recognized the absurdities to which such stories were liable, their tendency towards unintended comedy, and he wrote other stories satirizing or ridiculing the Blackwoods formula, and we'll look more closely at a couple examples of this next week. Next, I'm going to talk about first-person narration. Many of Poe's most popular stories, including most of what we're reading in this class, are narrated in the first-person point of view. That is, it's not Poe telling the story, rather, it is a character created by him, one who is invariably male and often the principal agent or participant in the events being described. What this means for the reader is that Poe's fiction rarely takes place in objective reality. What we see, what Poe allows us to see, is often incomplete or inaccurate. In The Pit and the Pendulum, for example, what we know of the dungeon is constrained by the limited knowledge of the narrator. This creates problems for readers trying to get at the truth of what actually happens in many of Poe's stories. And it's a problem we'll take up again later in this semester with the stories William Wilson and The Fall of the House of Usher. Finally, I want to talk about Poe's manipulation of narrative time, which he does to achieve different narrative effects. Sometimes he slows down time to create excruciating suspense for the reader. An excellent example of this can be found in the first 3 paragraphs on page 313, which describe the rhythmic motion, the oscillation and steady descent of the lethal pendulum. Down, steadily down it crept, he writes. The next paragraph, down, certainly, relentless, down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. And then the next paragraph, still, down, still, unceasingly still, inevitably down. Poe does this regularly in his narratives to create anxiety and suspense for the reader. But he can just as effectively accelerate the narrative with sudden and unexpected events that shock and astonish the reader, as with the arrival of General LaSalle's army in the anticlimactic last paragraph of the story. So I want to shift focus now to some of Poe's themes regarding primarily perception. So we're going to start with perception and reality, talk about reason and imagination, and then finish with consciousness and the unconscious. With regard to perception and reality, then, perception fails in Poe's stories, sometimes because the narrator is deprived of his senses, like when the narrator of The Pit and the Pendulum first wakes up in the darkness of his dungeon cell. Silence and stillness and night were the universe, he says. Other times, it may be because the narrator is in a state of extreme excitement, distress, or agitation. Either way, Poe's narrators often experience moments of acute hypersensitivity, describing sights, smells, tastes, sounds, and tactile sensations well beyond the pale of normal human experience. Take, for example, this passage on page 312. Days passed. It might have been that many days passed. The narrator has absolutely no sense of time. Ere the pendulum swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. Poe's narrators are also prone to synesthesia. This is a kind of derangement of the senses in which perceptions commingle and become distorted in a bizarre, disquieting fashion. They might, for example, describe the color of a smell or use tactile sensations to describe sounds. Related to the problem of perception and reality in Poe's stories are the mental faculties of reason and imagination. What Poe often means by reason is arriving at the truth through the application of established rules or careful observation. Imagination, on the other hand, is a creative faculty that does not necessarily abide by rules or rely on sense perception alone. Ideally, Poe believes that in a balanced mind, reason and imagination complement each other and work together. The hero of his detective stories, C'est Auguste Dupin, is the embodiment of this ideal. But his characters often attempt to use reason to understand their circumstances and solve problems. When they go astray, it is often because their imagination is unchecked. Overstimulated by psychological or environmental factors, the imagination fills in gaps in their understanding. Here's the narrator of The Pit and the Pendulum describing the candles burning as his sentence is handed down to him. This passage starts at the bottom of page 305. And then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first, they wore the aspect of charity and seemed white, slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill as if I had touched the wire of a galvanic battery, while the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. Finally, I want to talk about consciousness and the unconscious. The imagination often taps into the unconscious, the world of suppressed memories and inchoate desires, and Poe is always intensely interested in exploring the semi-permeable boundary that separates the waking world of daily experience from the hidden, mysterious forces shaping our lives. Forces beyond our conscious control, but that may be dimly apprehended in dreams and especially semi-conscious states induced by euphoria, terror, moral dissipation, physical exhaustion, or sensory deprivation. Poe delves into this question of boundaries and our passage to and fro between worlds in a long passage on page 306, where the narrator recounts his gradual return to consciousness in the dungeons of Toledo. Arousing from the most profound of slumbers, he writes, we break the gossamer web of some dream, yet in a second afterward, so frail may that web have been, we remember not that we have dreamed. In the return to life from the swoon, there are two stages. First, that of the sense of the mental or spiritual. Secondly, that of the sense of physical existence. It seems probable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we could recall the impressions of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond. And that gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? But if the impressions of what I have termed the first stage are not at will recalled, yet, after long interval, do they not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they come? He who has swooned is not he who finds strange palaces and wildly familiar faces in coals that glow, is not he who beholds floating in midair the sad visions that the many may not view, is not he who ponders ever the perfume of some novel flower, is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the meaning of some musical cadence which has never before arrested his attention. What I wanted to do in this video was provide a foundation of ideas to support you in your reading of Poe and prepare you for later homework assignments. Some of the concepts and ideas we've talked about here we will elaborate further in our reading of later stories, and of course there are others I'm saving for later. Until then.